Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and we've been talking about Noah as the earliest starting point that we can look to historically here from what we find. So we're talking about a figure who would date, according to what we've seen so far, from about 3000 BC to about 2000 BC, because of course the historical record presented in the Bible is that he lived a very, very long time, and he survived the flood. And we've asked, what kind of corroborating evidence do we find in the historical record, and would that fall within normal historical standards for using this as a basis for reconstructing history? So we got a little bit talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh before we had to stop the video for a second. And now we're going to pick back up with that. According to Easton's Bible Dictionary, it says that the most remarkable of these traditions, it's talking about other traditions around the world. In fact, they say traditions of the deluge or flood are found among all the great divisions of the human family. They say, also they note here, I should point out, that the flood, according to Genesis 7 and 8 and calculations based on the book of Genesis, would be about 2500 BC. So they say that there's other traditions around the world that are very similar to this. They say that these traditions are taken as a whole, wonderfully agree with the Bible, and the most remarkable of these traditions is that recorded on tablets prepared for Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria. These were, however, copies of older records which belong to somewhere about 2000 BC. So if the date of the flood is around 2500, and the date of the original documents here, or copies of these records for the king of Assyria, are 2000, that's within 500 years the flood is recorded, certainly within the standard that historians use when we look at historical evidence, historical documents, and archaeology in order to date or determine whether or not certain figures or events actually existed historically. According to Britannica, they have a very lengthy article here, and you can find this information elsewhere. Christian sites even give more detail than what we find in Britannica. But they summarize here at the end that the myths of a great flood are widespread over Eurasia and America. That's Europe, Asia, and America, basically all around the equator. This flood destroys, with few exceptions, a disobedient original population. We find stories of that around the world, and we've already seen some evidence from dating as early as 2000 BC, within 500 years of the alleged flood. Britannica also says here, as they describe various cultures that have these myths, it says that they again refer to the Gilgamesh epic, which we've already talked about. They said a fragment dating from about 1400 BC of that Babylonian epic has been found at Megiddo in Israel. And so we have evidence in terms of these tablets and things that date from 2000 BC with the king of Assyria, and also the Gilgamesh epic, which date from 1400 BC, within 1,000 years, or a little over 1,000 years of the flood itself, well within the historical standards for considering that to be a historically viable event. And so as we move forward from this point in time, the next major event that's depicted, particularly in the Old Testament historical records, is the Tower of Babel. We want to continue to ask, what kind of corroboration can we find for this? Is this a reasonable story? Is there good reason to believe that this historical record is accurate on this point? And we find, let's just talk about what the Tower of Babel is in the biblical record. According to Britannica, in the biblical literature, this is a structure built in the land of Shinar or Babylonia, sometime after the flood. And the myth, they say, may have been inspired by the Babylonian Tower Temple north at Marduk. And so they're actually comparing what they find archaeologically, the remains of this potential tower temple, to the Tower of Babel, and saying there could be some correspondence there. The next, what we're going to read here is from World Book Encyclopedia. And they state concerning the Tower of Babel that it's a story, the story of its construction is told in the Bible in Genesis 11. According to the Bible, Noah's descendants, the survivor of the flood, their descendants settled in southern Mesopotamia after the flood. And then from there, they're scattered all over the earth. Now, of course, if you look in more detail, you find that when they scatter, the languages of the world are scattered with them, and they go out with different languages. So what do we find about this idea that after the flood, people settled, as stated in the biblical record, in this area of Mesopotamia? Well, Britannica says, concerning the Fertile Crescent, that the region of the Middle East where civilizations of the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin began is known as the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent, in its widest extension, corresponds exactly to the region that plays a dominant role in the Hebrew traditions of Genesis. Okay, so there's some correspondence between what we know archaeologically as the earliest foundations, at least in that part of the world, the earliest civilizations, at least in that part of the world, and what the book of Genesis describes. It seems like there's at least some correspondence to Genesis as a historical record of this. And they go on here in Britannica say that this age-old belief that the earliest known culture originated in the Fertile Crescent has been confirmed by the development of radiocarbon dating. And so scientific evidence also corroborated that this area of Mesopotamia is the earliest area of civilization. So there seems to be, rather than reason to reject the book of Genesis and its accounts of early history, there seems to be both scientific and archaeological evidence that corresponds to it and supports it. The next figure that we want to talk about here is Abraham. This is the next major sequence in the chain of events. And according to Britannica, Abraham flourished in the early 2nd millennia BC, at least based upon the dates that are given in the Bible. It says, according to the biblical book of Genesis, Abraham left Ur in Mesopotamia because God called him to found a new nation in an undesignated land that he later learned was Canaan. So then they talk about this process of how we would analyze if Abraham, or what we can know about Abraham, is true. And they say that until the end of the 19th century, this area of time was unknown and considered virtually unknowable. But then they proceed a little further to describe the Genesis narrative in light of recent scholarship. It says the Hebrew text, in fact, locates the departure specifically at Ur-Kasdim, that is Abraham's departure. This Kasdim being none other than the Chaldew of the cuneiform texts at Mari. And so you have these cuneiform texts, they're archaeological historical evidence, and it conforms to what is described in the book of Genesis. Most scholars agree that Ur-Kasdim was the Sumerian city of Ur today. It's about 200 miles southeast of Baghdad in lower Mesopotamia. So it seems that there's archaeological evidence that Abraham left from a place in lower Mesopotamia, which was the Fertile Crescent, which evidence is confirmed as the earliest civilizations in that part of the world at least, and exactly what the Bible describes after the flood concerning Noah. And so it seems there's corroboration here. As we continue forward, they describe this area in Mesopotamia. They said it's been excavated between 1922 and 1934, and based on what they've excavated, it is certain that the cradle of the ancestors was the seat of a vigorous polytheism, and that there's been many surprising items in the thousands of tablets found in the palace at Mari. So they found archaeological evidence, and what does the archaeological evidence tell us? They say not only are the Hapiru, or Hebrews, mentioned, but also remarkably the Banu Yamina, the Benjaminites. And they describe that it's not that the latter, the Benjaminites, are identical with the family of Benjamin, the son of Jacob, but rather that a name with such biblical ring appears in extra-biblical sources in the 18th century BC. So what they're finding here is thousands of tablets that demonstrate that the names, and in fact the Hebrews themselves, are being described at this point in time. Tablets dating to the 18th century BC, exactly what we would expect if the biblical text as historical documents were accurate historical documents. So we find that there's evidence for Noah, we find there's evidence for the Tower of Babel, we find that there's evidence for Abraham, good archaeological outside evidence to corroborate the historical documentation that we find in the Bible itself. And so we'll put those as plot points on there, but as we move forward into history, we'll continue to see more and more historical evidence that we can analyze concerning the various religious beliefs and where they came from.